All right. Greetings, everybody. Very special conversation I have in store for you with Alan, aka Scribe Wolf, who is actually been a comrade of our program for several years, and actually has participated in some of our study groups, and has most notably been the creator of several scores of music that have appeared in the opening for Emancipation's podcast. So, Alan, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me today. We are going to be discussing a book primarily, but we're also going to be looking more broadly at the question of the political economy of music, um, Marxism, and what does Marxism have to say about music. So this is a conversation which will be philosophical. Alan is obviously a musician, and we are also at some point soon going to hear a sort of excerpt of a new composition that Alan has created and discuss it. But primarily, we wanted to sort of center our conversation around I don't know if you agree with this, Alan, but I think probably one of the most important theoretical investigations, theoretical texts into music, into the phenomenon of the political economy of music, which is Jacques Attali's Noise, subtitle A Political Economy of Music, published in 1977. Um, a very interesting book, right? Which you see influences from René Girard, from Deleuze and Guattari, no doubt, from French theory. The author is an economist. I assume also a musician of some sort,
Yep,
uh,
yep, yep.
also a theorist. So, Alan, welcome to the show. It's a real joy to have you on here.
Yeah, thank you for that warm welcome. It's been a long time in the making. I think we've been talking about this for quite some time. If I'm not mistaken, that I'm your first musical guest, and I'm excited to see this open up perhaps some possibilities for more conversations on aesthetics and poetics in general in the program, as it were. And yeah, I want to say I come primarily as a practitioner of music. I certainly have a scholarly background in Marxism, in psychoanalysis, and medievalism, which I hope to plumb a little bit as sort of questions of periodization come up related to that text and other ones. But I want to come primarily from the focus of what it means to practice music, primarily in an environment that's always already politicized. I don't think there is such a thing as a music that can exist in its inception apolitically. And now, what that means, I think, is very arguable and up for dispute. But nonetheless, we're given this problematic of music as a political form of art. One thing I wanted to bring up, I thought about many different ways of sort of entering this conversation. I was sort of just optioning many different ways of possibly, um, you know, uh, uh, swerving into this discussion. But there was a news item that struck me yesterday, and it was in the Washington Post. It just sort of came up on my screen, and that's the esteemed pianist Maurizio Pollini died yesterday, and rest in peace to him. He was a great practitioner of both the classics and not only the avant-garde, but I'd say the hyper avant-garde. What I'd classify as, I mean, don't worry if this is sounding specialist, but like the post Darmstadt Italian scene, this legacy of this post serialist scene. And it's very interesting because one of his comrades, and this is where kind of the question of politics comes in, was Luigi Nono. They were both sort of either members of or fellow travelers of the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, at various points in their life. And Luigi Nono, especially, was a very politicized composer. A lot of people don't think of the avant-garde as inherently political. I think nowadays there's actually especially a strong backlash against the avant-garde as maybe neoliberal in character, decadent in character. But Luigi Nono was relentlessly political, even stridently and vociferously political at a certain point. And he produced these great operas. There were these huge, ambitious, towering works that often set these Brechtian, sometimes literally Brechtian libretti to music. And one of them, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation. I am monolingual, but is Algran Solicarico d'Amor. And I believe the two struggles that are at the center of that one is the Paris Commune and the October Revolution. And, when I say this is, certainly just a completely towering, ambitious project, I don't think he even attempted in his late sort of era, as is classified, to really go back to doing something that ambitious and elephantine in vision again, just because the amount of work it took to produce it. But one thing that really interested me is the sort of dialectical back and forth between that register of actually having explicit politics in the textual setting of the music, the little linguistic matter of the music, and what he did for his friend, the pianist Maurizio Pollini, who died yesterday. And that was a piece that Pollini commissioned from Luigi Nono. And this sort of, I think maybe I'm getting my sort of periodization of Nono himself a little bit incorrect, but sort of kicked off a quieter late stage in Nono's work. And this is one of the most important pieces to me in my classical training. And that was a piece called Sofferte onde serene. That translates roughly to suffering serene waves, and is bounded by ellipses on either end in the title. It's a really meditative and quiet piece. It's for piano and tape, meaning it's an electroacoustic piece. It's just brilliant. It's meditative. It's calm. It's even desultory. It's devastating. It's beautiful, and it has no trace of sort of political linguistic matter in it. And it's amazing that these two comrades could come together and have one of the most profound pieces of art that binds them be this completely sort of non-politics signifying piece of music. And I think that really, I guess I tell this story because it really brings home to me that there is something beyond, a realism here to be plumbed. There is something beyond a simple didacticism, that appears as vulgar to me. There's something more important to Marxism than a hortatory gesture in art. Because, what is the point of art if it, what is the point of music if at the end of the day it doesn't sound good to our ears? And so I guess in this particular gesture, what I think is particularly important is what I'd roughly map onto Badiou's conditions of philosophy, which is, art stands as its own, excuse me, truth procedure that's distinct and maybe even contradistinct to the domain of politics. It's contradistinct in some ways to the domain of love in the procedure of truth, and is contradistinct in some ways to the procedure of science. I'm not saying necessarily in every single way it fetches towards a new horizon of truth, and maybe because I know you have deep immersion in the sort of Bedouin texts, you might want to problematize this, but I think very much so when we combine the idea that art is political and politics is artistic, I think there needs to be a complexification of the idea that you can just kind of, in a vulgar way, mash them together, and there you have it, political art.
Yeah, great, Alan. A really great way to kick it off.
Thank you.
For folks that don't, know about Badiou's conception, one way we could summarize his idea is obviously Badiou is known as the philosopher of the event. Now, in his being an event, and then later, from like the mid 1980s till now, he's argued that events occur as ruptures within four predominant conditions, and art would obviously be the condition in which musical events occur. And so you see there's a certain autonomy of the aesthetic artistic domain, and that artists or musicians, while they don't have a non-relation to politics, they certainly in Badiou's sense are not fundamentally politicized. Now, I think to connect that to Jacques Attali's work, I would argue, Alan, and I want to see if you agree, that what we find in Attali's conception of the musician is almost like that music is so fundamentally bound up with political truths, with the field of politics in some ways. And of course, when we say that, he's relying on a development of a very sophisticated historicist theory for how music has evolved from post-French Revolution up to what he calls the regime of representation that emerged
Mhm.
after the French Revolution,
Mhm.
and then what you might call the postmodern era, which is the regime of difference and of, well, what he calls repetition as well.
Yeah.
And in that domain, uh, the musician, even though they are no longer tethered to the political project of valorizing a national entity or valorizing a particular regime of representation, whether that be a class or a particular instantiation of a collectivity. He argues that, today in the postmodern era, musicians therefore are kind of what he calls like heralds of almost to have a certain prophetic capacity, for understanding sociality and social political formations outside of time. So there's a certain thing that we can talk about, the vocation of the musician for Attali, which I think would be different than the vocation of the musician as safe as it would for Alain Badiou. That's one contrast that I see there. But I mean, let's be a little more concrete. Badiou is fond of saying that when you have an event happen with an art, one way to understand that, and I want your take on this, Alan, because I'm not a musician, is a musician performs a kind of innovation which fundamentally transforms the existing form in such a way where all other musicians are never going to look at that old form the same way again. They can still make a career and a life out of playing within this particular musical repertoire, but when you have an event done on that form and you've introduced some new form, there's no going back. And he uses the example of Schoenberg and the transition from tonal and atonal music. He has other examples as well, in art and painting, for example, that are similar to this. So that's kind of Badiou's idea, right? Can you talk about the merits and the perhaps shortcomings of Badiou's theory of musical events?
Yeah, I think an evental reading, in the sense of historiography, is not necessarily, in conflict. I mean, certainly there's points of, I think, dissonance here, no pun intended, but I don't think it's necessarily in conflict with Attali's historiography, in that this ultimately brings up a question of periodization, and I know we've been talking about that a lot leading up to this conversation, and I really want to press that because as you mentioned, Noise was published in 1977. That's almost a half century ago. A lot has happened since then, and a lot in music especially has happened since then. uh Bifo Berardi, the Italian sociologist, published a book maybe about 10 years ago called Heroes, and it's an interesting study, and it's mainly a study of mass shootings, of what he calls the so-called autistic psychosphere. But he really does an interesting thing in tying it to this problematic of postmodernism by linking it to this founding moment, this sort of urtext of David Bowie, Heroes in 1977. And so I think this opens up a really broad question. I don't claim to have the answer. Even the sort of thesis I'm going to push here, which is the neo-feudalism thesis, the theorist I look to the most, Jody Dean, admits in a very humble way, and I think a really great way, that she is still not, at least as of the articles I read, not particularly confident that that really names a true new mode of production, but it is a useful question to mull over for Marxists, who I think are traditionally pretty conservative in willing to admit that the sort of teleology of the traditional Marxian texts, as it were probably not completely fully fleshed out. Now, when it comes to event and politics, I think Attali's text does something pretty interesting, because you might ask, why does music provide this sort of heraldic function, as you mentioned? Why is it a prophet in a way? Why is it um, a sort of, is a total coincidence, but my song that you'll be playing is called the Augury. Why is it an augur of times to come? Politically, it's an augur of times to come. And Attali makes a very precise argument here. It's that I think in a way he even suggests that musicians represent the first class division. I think that's more of a rhetorical gesture. That would be very much departing from, sort of Marxian orthodoxy right there. But he has this conception that is not a sort of naturalistic materialist argument, but that music in a way precedes the division into language, and that we have a sort of ubiquity against which music forms. um, we have the sound ubiquity that we have as noise. Noise, in a way, is all around us. It represents existence. It represents life. In a way, silence is mapped onto death, non-being, non-existence. And so, with noise representing the sort of way of things, the being of things, a sort of thrownness, if as it were, however you want to put it, um, it is sort of a power of function, or a function of power, excuse me, a function of power to be able to disrupt that and organize noise. Now, there's a reference for that I'm not sure he mentions anywhere explicitly in the text, but that actually comes from this hypermodernist composer named Edgar Varese. He had a very simple definition for what music is. And keep in mind, this is sort of at the moment, you mentioned Schoenberg. This is at the moment, this modernist moment, when the definition of music is expanding greatly. We're sort of seeing new horizons, a new avant-garde of what is possible for the expression of the human soul in terms of the sound format. And he simply defined it as organized sound, organized sounds. That might be a paraphrase, but it was basically as simple as that. And so, in a way, this organized noise represents the power of the musician. And Attali then goes on from this non-naturalistic materialist definition of the power of the class of musician to map out different modes of production. As you mentioned, there is sacrifice, there is representation, there is repetition, and there is something very vague that he suggests, which is composition, a maybe utopian, a maybe dystopian future, that he says secretes already in the present. This is 1977, but is not really in a rush to suggest what that is. And so I am very interested, actually, in maybe like pushing that question forward a little. I know I peregrinated maybe around your initial prompt, and I'm not sure I exactly remember what it was originally
Sure.
at that point, but I do think this gets us to the question of events and
Yeah.
perhaps what that can lead us to in terms of using music as a way to read our current conjuncture.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the thing that in reading Noise by Attali, the thing that strikes me that's interesting is this idea that political music for him is always, in a certain sense, destined to be um, non-revolutionary. Like I get the feeling that in some way music cannot be um, coded by a state project. Say, for example, after the French Revolution, the Jacobins have an interest in organizing the um, sort of status or the function of the musician in a way that serves the purpose and the interests of the revolution. Okay. Or say after Stalin, uh, the ludic and the festival like creation of new myths of the socialist society have to be geared from the representational apparatus of the state outward. Now, those that poses an interesting challenge uh, to the left in the sense that for most of the time, capitalism subordinates the musician, especially in the feudal period, according to Attali. Like he uses the example of how Mozart, I think, was treated as a musician in terms of his wage contract. Like, what was the contract of the musician? And how does the contract of the musician change over time? Right. And there is therefore a certain downside of Attali. Perhaps maybe downside's the wrong word, but peculiar mystery for me. And I want your thoughts on this, which is uh, in a certain way, a regime of an egalitarian revolutionary state, let's say, uh, when they seek to coordinate or direct uh, the contract or the aesthetic direction and production of the musician, Attali argues that this reinforces a certain static form of identity. So he plays off identity and difference, and it almost undermines the goals of the revolution. So there's a certain reading that one could make of Attali's book, and tell me if you think this is unfair, which actually is quite libertarian, which would make sense because the Deleuze and Guattari have that libertarian leftist thing going on, which obviously on our channel and from my point of view, everyone is pretty well knows that I'm very critical of libertarianism on the left. I think that left libertarianism is kind of a contradiction in terms for reasons which we've talked about before. But still, nonetheless, that's one of the questions that I have here, right? Which is something we see in Nietzsche as well, an awareness, and this is to Nietzsche's credit, okay, that the Apollinian and Dionysian dichotomy, that this Janus face, this split, right, is itself uh, uh, based on the idea that music can never be captured or coded in the Deleuze-Guattari sense by a state apparatus in some sense.
Yeah, so I think
What are your
Adelie
thoughts on this?
Adelie does a very clever job of hedging against this sort of, accusation of a static, sort of vulgar conception of the musician as sanctioned by the state is always already captured by the state apparatus, and that any sort of state attempts to represent ideology, as it were, is already repressive or dominant or hegemonic in nature, in that he always demonstrates some subversive or transgressive side to it, as in when he points to a remainder in the psychoanalytic sense with the attempts to capture jazz. Of course, there's a notorious kind of Adorno take, as it were, on jazz, and this is a pretty unfair representation. Adorno really didn't actually have exposure to the overall breadth of what jazz was at the time, and I think that's a pretty good representation of actually the sort of corporate capture of jazz, in fact, and how Attali might describe that there are always subversive traces, residues that aren't immediately recuperated by the state. And that can certainly give way to, I guess, a libertarian notion of bohemianism that might be valorized in a sense. But I think it can actually have a weird counter libertarian critique. And hear me out on this. Maybe this doesn't make sense to you. But in an era when it actually, I think this might have been intentional. It might have been a slip. But when you described the era of repetition, you first said difference. And that very much goes together in the Deleuzian text. It also, I think, very much goes together in this post 1977 version of repetition that Attali is talking about. I think we live actually in a quite dystopian era of music in which difference and repetition have been collapsed. I think we live in a sort of libertarianism that is fully endorsed by the state, that any representation of identity is at once difference, and any representation of difference is at once identity, if that makes sense. There is a strong streak of identitarianism that is presented as a sort of fully optional difference, and there is a difference that gets fully subsumed into the self-sameness of identity with the state. Um, and I think Attali has a great example for this. Again, David Bowie, when he mentions that the Beatles and David Bowie have started off as these almost evental figures, he also mentions, and again, he did not really see this happening in 1970s, maybe with the Beatles, but with David Bowie, not quite yet. He mentions that they will become molds. He calls them molders, I believe. Particular molds that once they were figures of sacrifice, they were uh, almost figures of this sacrificial murder. He talks about ritual murder, in which taboo is represented in their ability to uh, place an incision in the current order of things, to enact a scission in the symbolic. But then that creates a mold by which different sort of facsimiles of those musicians emerge. And then we have more David Bowies. We have more glam rock. We have more new wave. We have more, new wave revival. Et cetera, et cetera, until we have these sort of meager sub genres that are nostalgia pastiches bricollated into other sub genres. It's all sort of a meager theater of difference that I'm not sure really adds up even to a true libertarianism. I think this is why the neo-feudal thesis, in fact, and maybe this is where we can kind of get to this, is important. I think it's gotten quite a negative response from a lot of the Marxist left because, in fact, it was once proposed. I don't know if this is the original form. I believe Habermas, um, and maybe some world system theorists originally sort of were the progenitors of the term. But in the 90s, very notably, neo-feudalism came about as like a discourse within libertarian economic theory. And so it's like very much frowned upon in, I think, Marxist circles for that reason. But I think it's been taken up by Varoufakis and Jody Dean in some really salient and important ways. And the reason that it was salient for libertarians at first was they saw something that they did not quite like in the direction of neoliberal capitalism. And that's precisely that it had been ossifying into a type of authoritarian neoliberalism, a type of authoritarian libertarianism, in fact, that sort of resembled the residues of feudalism that capitalism couldn't quite shake.
Yeah,
A sort of
I hear you.
thermidor of
Yeah,
feudalism.
right. I mean, I think part of this we have to introduce the body and affect into the mix here, because I think we should never forget that um, for Nietzsche, for example, one of the insights with Nietzsche, part of the postmodernist turn to body and affect is owed to Nietzsche's insights into things like aesthetic forms, right? So, for
Right, right.
example, if opera, right, is opposed by Nietzsche because of its feminine-like qualities, well, there's a certain mimesis, there's a certain sort of effect that musical forms can have on the masses. And so in Nietzsche's critique of music, it's already bound up with a critique of the masses as a political formation. And that actually is linked actually in some sense to Adorno's critique of jazz also, because in Adorno's critique of jazz, I think you also have something like a kind of argument, right? That unhinged expressivism can be coded by capitalist commodification, and that therefore it's not necessarily subversive. So if Adorno is coming at it from a Marxist point of view, one of the questions you want to ask yourself is how do you define the subversiveness or potential subversiveness of a given musical form? And I
That's
want you
that
to, I'd like for you to comment on that, but wait a sec. If we go back then to Bifo's argument in Heroes and Bifo's argument about punk, right? Which is the punk, for example, represents a kind of post-political, not necessarily in a Fukuyamist way, but kind of like that,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Where it's like punk is actually uber political, but it's not subversive. So there's a certain awareness of that distinction between politicized versus truly subversive.
Right, right.
How would you
Yes.
parse that out?
So it's interesting that you bring up Nietzsche. I mean, as you know, I'm really not a Nietzsche person, so feel free to jump in and correct me at any time. But Nietzsche was an amateur composer, and he clearly held music probably in the highest regards among the arts, in its ability, in the famous dialectic presented in The Birth of Tragedy to enact the Dionysian sort of side of that duality, that dyad. I think that his main sort of musical efforts were around the time that he met Holderlin. He also there,
Wagner.
sorry.
Wagner.
Yeah, yeah, yes. There's a funny story there. Let me actually read this. So he was actually humiliated a number of times as an amateur composer. He was not great for the time, but he wasn't that bad. Nonetheless, I don't want to like ascribe any authorial biographical sort of significance to this, but he was humiliated many times. One of them was writing a piece for Wagner's wife, and the sort of drama there. This might be totally apocryphal, but at the event for Wagner's wife's birthday, Wagner was reported to be literally laughing like out loud, rolling on the floor. By the end of the piece being performed, it was apparently like just that offensive. There's another incident. Oh, I have to read this. He sent I believe a piano piece called the Manfred Meditation to a prominent conductor, Hans von Bülow, and you know as a sort of collegial response. This is the best collegial response von Bülow could summon. He wrote back, "Your Manfred meditation is the most extreme case of fantastic extravagance, the most unedifying and anti-musical instance of notes placed on music paper that I have come across in a long time. Several times I had to ask myself, is the whole thing a joke? And did you perhaps intend a parody of the so-called music of the future? Did you consciously flout all the rules of musical language, from the higher syntax to simple matters of correct notation? Apart from the psychological interest, your musical fever product gives evidence, despite all the confusion, of an uncommonly distinguished spirit. Your meditation is, from the musical standpoint, the equivalent of a crime in the moral world. I could discover no trace of Apollonian elements, and as for the Dionysian, to be frank, I was reminded more of the morning after a bacchanalian orgy than of an orgy per se. And then he goes on, once again, no offense intended. You yourself describe your music as quote unquote horrible. It is actually more horrible than you realize, not in a way that is harmful to the common interest, but worse than that, harmful to you. Um, so he was just completely just, you know, symbolically castrated in the eyes of these peers that he held to the highest esteem in this genre. He held in the highest esteem, and I think, you know, this demonstrates what's at stake when you consider such an art form subversive.
Mm,
And this
mm,
is what's at stake when you consider like Adorno and
right.
Nietzsche in very different ways, albeit music as something that can counter the Apollonian elements, as it were,
Yeah,
like the
there
the
is.
the
That's
rational, you know.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
go
that's
ahead.
really interesting. Oh, I just wanted to respond to that if I could very quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Uh, so by speaking biographically on Nietzsche, his father dies when he's really, really young, and Nietzsche's first memory um, of music is the choral music that played at his father's funeral. And throughout Nietzsche's life, anytime he heard that choral music, it brought him back to the question of the father. And there's been people that have written about how the first time that Nietzsche heard Wagner's music before he met him, how it broke him from that trance that he had with the father. So there's this certain kind of name of the father relationship that Nietzsche has to Wagner
Mm,
and music that is very, very psychobiographically useful. And people have written about this. Um, I'm thinking of Tracy, I think it's Tracy Strong on Nietzsche and Oedipus, where music plays like a very central role. And I think the other point there is Nietzsche understood in The Birth of Tragedy, out of the spirit of music as the subtitle, right? Uh, how Wagnerian music can actually play a role as a political collective agency, or rather, how music can galvanize a collectivity. And I think that that is so obviously essential. He's not the perhaps not the first person to make this argument, but it is a political insight which every avant-garde, every bohemian, every subversive leftist movement will have its own score, its own compositions, its own musicians. Now, the same is true of right-wing fascist movements as well. I mean,
sure.
there's the famous example of like Cardinal Richelieu in the
Yeah.
Hundred Years' War, the poet of massacre, the poet that, or the, you know, the, so there's an aesthetic dimension in politics which is inescapable. I'm thinking here, for example, of authors that I used to love when I was very young, the beat authors like William S. Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Jack
Oh,
Kerouac.
yeah.
They wouldn't make sense without jazz, right?
For sure.
Everything, everything was about. But then the question that the form of the beats and jazz both raised was, what's the meaning of spontaneity in the historical conjuncture in which they were living and creating? And then, of course, you can then immediately link that question of spontaneity of forms to the New Left, to Bob Dylan, to the Grateful Dead, right? And the Grateful Dead become the instantiation of the incorporation of different musical styles under the banner of a, like, let's say, like a fully achieved spontaneism, right? Um, so anyways, I'm just sort of freestyling here with, I'm being spontaneous with you
Speaking of
here.
improv, yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and that sort of brings us to the conjuncture that's inaugurated by the ending of Attali's inquiry, right? And I think there's two questions here. What does it mean precisely to be subversive within the domain of art and music? And is that the same thing as being politically subversive? Should that be a desirable thing? You know, does it have the same value? Does it have a value to socialism? Does it have a value to the movement? Is it something that a party needs to agitate for? Is it the business of a party, et cetera, et cetera? And number two, then there's a question of particular forms in relation to that. You brought up spontaneity and improv, and I think that might be a good way to introduce this improv project that I've embarked on.
I think
In
it's
sort of
excellent. I think
yeah,
it's
yeah,
excellent. Let's introduce it now, and then
yeah,
we'll go
sure,
back, because the other thing I want to talk about after we introduce your piece, Augur, is asceticism and Lenin's position on fine music. But that we'll wait. We'll wait for that. So Alan, I want to introduce your piece. What we're going to do is sort of pause the video and insert it so folks can hear it, and then we'll discuss before. But set it up for us. Give us a background
yeah.
before I press play.
So normally I perform sort of indie rock, alt country as my main, I guess, popular music genre under the name Scribe Wolf. Um, but I've recently started a collaboration with a Portland-based black metal musician who normally performs under the name Yfelsian. He has an experimental black metal project, and we've embarked on this collaboration because we have, I guess, three common interests here. That's number one, black metal, that sort of genre that's burgeoning into this overall post metal umbrella. Number two, medievalism. We both have, coincidentally, I guess, medievalist academic backgrounds. And number three, just an overall concern for free improvisation. That's something that Attali brings up as a potential notion of composition, a potential problematic that might occur in this era of composition. So, without further ado, this is The Augury by Lunafaction. It will be coming out sometime soon.
All right, that was awesome, man. I really enjoyed that. So
Thank you.
The Argent moment. This is so tell us about this. So you said something regarding improv and how when you're making this with your collaborator, describe how improvisation played into that.
So improvisation factored on multiple levels. That actually happened on the level of form and in the creation itself. And here's where, well, I'll get to it, but repetition actually comes in as well. So I started by simply kind of just messing around on my guitar. I often just post these like bedroom experiments, these daily projects, in sort of private social spaces, and Jacob just hopped on it and added instruments, and it was a sort of back and forth, just a completely contingent experiment, and just completely unexpected. I think you mentioned even uh, 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 contingency as like this chief factor in this Nietzschean wish for the revival of the aristocratic. But is this sort of contingent experience that culminated in this piece, that was both improvisatory in the situation in which it occurred and improvisational in the actual tracking of the instruments. What I mean by tracking is, track by track, we recorded the instruments without any notation. It's just totally free improv. That's a genre that basically comes out of free jazz primarily, but then also is inspired very much by 20th century classical music, what a lot of lay people refer to as like noise music often. A lot of genres feeding into that, as you heard, there's a lot of dissonance, atonality, and probably it's a lot of misery laid upon the layperson's ears. But
Yeah.
there's this question of repetition too. I don't know if Attali formally cites Benjamin anywhere
Yeah.
in his discussion of repetition. You might be able to bring that up if you have any recollection of it. But obviously, Benjamin, I think, is really the urtext of what it means to have the the repetitive commodity form really define the form of the aesthetic dimension of that commodity form in the 20th century. And so, if you think of the fact that we're performing not on a stage, but in the post-COVID world, we're performing across the country, back and
Hmm.
forth for exchange, essentially, on Bandcamp, on streaming platforms.
Hmm.
That this is something that's improvisational, but at the same time completely premeditated. That can be
Hmm.
assembled bit by bit. I'm an audio engineer also. I'm a producer also. So I'm carefully like doing all the mixing, automation curves,
Hmm.
plugins, doing the mastering bus, all that stuff. It's a carefully constructed piece as well. And I know folks might not hear that, but there's a lot of hours sunk in to that sort of thing. I can tell
Yeah.
you way more hours sunk in to the actual production end of it than the actual performing end of it.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That's helpful. No, that's really good. I really enjoyed the piece, and I like all of your music. By the way, the short composition you created, which has a kind of spooky neo-Wagnerian vibe from my book, How to Read Like a
Yeah, yeah.
Parasite, that's on the YouTube channel. I also really enjoyed that. So
Thank
clearly,
you very much. Yeah.
you bring a lot of like a lot of knowledge and talent to the to your work. Wanted to actually introduce the question of taste and distinction. And this might be a way for folks to understand some of these theoretical points regarding music in a way which can relate to social class. We can bring social class into the picture, perhaps. When I was growing up, there was, in a bourgeoisist sense, I think, a sense in which taste, musical taste, defined and codified you
Yeah.
into a
Yeah.
particular relationship to education and to like class stratifications. And I remember, even anecdotally speaking for myself, when I was working like construction, before I really entered into the world of books and ideas, my musical taste was fundamentally different. And so musical taste is something which you mentioned, the point of contingency. Musical taste is at the heart of cultural distinctions and class distinctions. And I think that that's quite interesting because part then, therefore, of what experimental or avant-garde music or non-commercial music could do is break one's subjectivity from um, codified or stratified forms of social class. In so doing, that can be good for Marxist politics or socialist politics, but it could also be bad. Like, for example, perhaps we might say, well, let's not make a big fuss about a superficial D class A position, right? So you think here of like the contemporary experimental music scene, and they may actually put more of an onus on their political subversiveness than is really true. So there's that question, right? And so how do we? The question for me is, how do we accurately and honestly appraise subversiveness in political terms,
For
right?
sure. Like,
Yeah. Like,
there is
you catch
no
where I'm coming with this?
yeah, there
Go
is
ahead.
no doubt that there is a certain impenetrable barrier that is kept up, right? There is academic composing on the one hand, and despite, say, Luigi Nono, who I mentioned in the beginning, despite his best attempts to stage, say, his operas for the workers, even in factory sites, I believe, I mean, that stuff was not really received well. These clashing dissonant tones, these completely boisterous scenes, they were totally foreign. They were certainly courageous experiments, but they were not really uh, anywhere close to the popular music that anyone would consider, say, entertainment. Now,
Right.
I would say there's a caricature out there. There's a caricature that all this sort of avant-garde scene resides in what one might call like a bohemian petty bourgeoisie, like PMC, sort of state public funded trust fund kids scene, whatever. Um, I'd like to suggest those barriers are breaking down. Sure, there are like lots of state funded projects. There are a sort of academic composition enclaves. Most of the avant-garde musicians I know at this point have day jobs. They have 9 to 5s. They come home sweaty, tired, broken from work, and they pick up their guitars. They go to the piano, etc., etc. And so, while it is certainly a minority position to have within that milieu, it's one that is there. And I think that might be a subversive strand that maybe even within our circuits of communicative capitalism is more accessible nowadays. I think that's maybe
Sure.
one optimistic way of looking at it. Certainly,
Yeah.
we grew up in the same decade. Like, you are automatically interpolated into not only which class you're in, but which scene you're in. Which subculture
Mhm.
you're in. Your
Mhm.
grunge, your indie, your punk. Um,
Mhm.
but I would suggest there's more porous ways to break out of it. I'm not really that optimistic actually, but like that is my most open interpretation. One anecdote I'd like to bring up is that realization really hit me when I first read the biography of the Pulitzer Prize winning composer John Luther Adams, who composes in what you might call a minimalist or post minimalist style. And I'd recommend everyone go listen to the composition. I believe it's called 4,000 Holes. Very similar to Thousand Plateaus, so I might have gotten that messed up. But 4,000 Holes is a piece for piano and I believe, a chamber ensemble. But I read his biography, and there were the usual suspects, but he grew up listening on punk tapes, to punk records, all that sort of rebel music, and that was the first time I read a sort of important avant-garde composer biography where they actually sort of grew up on the same music I listened to, or at least grew up on that music concomitant to a classical training. And so we've entered that generation. We've breached that 1977 point, and we've
Mm.
entered a generation of totalizing popular music, in which maybe that world of classical music has become even more inaccessible, but people are starting from a place of sort of perceived rebellion and
Mhm.
have more of the resources of actual rebellion. Um, I know that's
Yeah.
simplistic, but
No, that makes sense. That
yeah.
makes sense. I mean, I think for Lenin, um, it was 2 issues. One is a revolutionary, um, should be encouraged to be fluent and even have some mastery over bourgeois forms of musical, um, accomplishment, because that's in line with Lenin's understanding of the overcoming of bourgeois society. Um, he's not posing a kind of one-sided abolition of no, he's proposing a dialectical sublation of bourgeois society. So of course, all forms of bourgeois music have to be understood and incorporated and so on. Then there's another issue, which is once you are a decided political militant, there's the question of what like Aristotle called music as catharsis,
Mhm.
right? Which I think we should never lose sight of. Like if you think, for example, of a composer like John Mouse today, right?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Controversial guy. Yeah, he's
yeah.
controversial. He's this, he's that. He's caught in this kind of interminable generational conflict and incoherence because of his Gen X origins, I would argue. And so he has this strange thing with Ariel Pink and Trump, and it's all silly. But at the core of John Mouse's project is an understanding, I think, of the cathartic dimension of what music can do as a political force, precisely because he has a highly sophisticated idea of how popular music regressed to a kind of medieval form structure in the 1980s, and how he wants to replicate that, but then bring subjectivity out of it for a cathartic transcendence of it in some sense. He may not use the language of catharsis, but what I'm trying to say is that he's thought about it at this level. But Lenin would use the language of catharsis, and Mark Fisher, in his late work on acid
Mhm.
communism, you may remember, raises this point where he makes a distinction between the Leninist ascetic left and the counterculture left. And that's actually a distinction that I think is very useful because it does go back, Alan, to, I think, in a certain sense, the question of catharsis and pleasure. Music as pleasure. Sorry for that stupid like thing. I don't know why it does that. I did not do that.
It's all
Um,
it's pleasurable, yeah, yeah.
I
The
know
little
it's so
jolt of
weird.
pleasure right there.
Yeah, automated algorithmic pleasure. But see, Lenin is for the side of restraint because he was asked, famously, I've mentioned this before on the show, right? Should a revolutionary, like, to what extent should they indulge in music? And Lenin says you should restrain. And that's actually an interesting point. I think in the era of Spotify for us, I think actually you could read Lenin's point in a certain way, like in a very simple psychologistic way. And I don't mean to be cheap here, but like it is true that when you deprive yourself of music and then like let's say you have deprived yourself of listening for a while, and you know that feeling, you go on a walk and you're alone and you have your great headphones on and you immerse yourself into it. After that deprivation, there's nothing like it. So that's a fact at a sensorial or even like physiological level of the human being, right? So I think he's saying it like that, right? I think he's saying a pretty simple point, even about like the human body physiological desiring system. And so you need to be cautious, therefore, about music qua consumption and pleasure and control yourself. And I think that's valid.
I
However,
ab
I think, but one more point, I think
Sure.
where it can go awry is what we need in a certain way is to understand how the Dionysian, right? How the ludic expressiveness of certain musical forms on the left um, relate to the project of emancipatory politics and do not get subsumed or rolled up in the like my little brother is a manager of indie rock bands, so I know pretty well and firsthand. I've had, even in this basement where I'm doing this, I've had indie rock bands stay the night in this basement where I'm recording from, and I know the scene pretty well. I know some of the politics behind it and some of the financial dynamics behind it, and I don't know, like, in a certain way, it is true, right, that the Dionysian is already just captured, like, the generational expression that comes from the scene when you're young in your 20s and you're going to music festivals and stuff like that, um in a certain way now is so delinked or detethered
Yeah.
from politics that it is concerning. And I think that most artists know how difficult it is to try to remain a political artist. Um, and the truth is, what ends up happening is that once you get to a certain level of commercial viability, the degree to which you can remain a subversive political voice is extremely hard. I'm thinking here of, like, Neil Young. Uh, Neil Young has no socialism. He has a moral voice, but his moral voice always reinforces the Democratic Party line.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? I'm thinking of Rage Against the Machine.
Eddie Vedder, yeah, Sleaford Mods, that sort of
Rage
thing.
Against the Machine, like, all of these projects have what we might call an ephemeral political thrust. So I guess, Alan, let me form this in a question. Where does politics appear? Truly subversive politics. And it may not appear in places that you would expect it to appear. For example, maybe it appears in forms of rap music that you wouldn't even see as political, like trap.
Mm.
For me, trap is so interesting because it's all bodily and affect. There's no intellectual rationality really going on in trap music. No, it's a subterranean expression of a certain impotence and deadlock in um, social life in the inner cities and blighted exurbs, like all the places where BLM emerged from.
Mhm.
That's where trap is very popular. You know what I'm saying? So it expresses something. That expression is itself an aesthetic political expression, even though it has no intention to be, perhaps. So that's how I would read the political appearance of. In other words, I think Attali's right that representation of political music never has a one-to-one correspondence with reality.
Right, right.
No, politicized art in music appears where you don't expect it to appear.
Yeah, so, oh my gosh, the episode in which Daniel Tutt is finally converted to the merits of affect theory. No, no, I'm kidding. I am going to cite Althusser here. He has a very interesting thing that he dropped in one interview, I believe. I don't believe he did any television interviews. I could be wrong, but he had a radio interview this one time, and he used this interesting phrase, "islands of communism," to describe what he thought was actually the appearance of this, level way, this autonomous way, this quote unquote free association um, form of society that had already appeared in this capitalist mode of production. And, he kind of rambled on some weird stuff and said some incoherent things in that interview, but it didn't really strike me as a prefigurative notion of politics. It just meant that there were ways in which we already practiced communism that perhaps needed to be freed of their rationalistic kernel. And I think that's where this issue of catharsis is really important, and where maybe we can come full circle on the discussion with Noise by Jacques Attali, which is, I think this historiographic reading is especially important when it comes to issues of listening. You don't have to be a musician, but we need to listen. Political or not, musician or not, we need to listen to noise, to music, to sound matter. all of that comprises not just some vulgar notion of what the superstructure, what the culture war is, but the actual material base and the totality of, the society we live in. And so when it comes to things like popular music, I would absolutely not take an elitist stance. In fact, Adorno, very contra the notion that people have about him being one of the most cantankerous elitists ever in the Marxian tradition, admitted that, there were like completely sublime qualities about even the most, the lowest forms of folk practice that no one would ever hear because they would never be committed to reproducible forms of distribution. And you mentioned forms of black music. Well, Jacques Attali mentions this moment in jazz just, emerging as well, a decade or so in the making as he's writing this book called Free Jazz. And that informs actually the track that we listen to, which is, this moment inaugurated by Ornette Coleman and others, that is this bursting forward. It is this musical event in the Bedouin sense that really is just bursting at the seams of corporatized, completely ossified, stiff, hypostatized, just Muzak style jazz, the type of jazz that Adorno would have bristled at. And it's this radical form that is actually to this day not really quite in sync with that exchange value format. It's mainly a live format. And I'd like to propose that as actually something fairly political, something that's always out of the grasp of capture. I can't really speak to trap. I'm not, I haven't listened to hip hop since the 2000s. I'm really kind of that, old at this point. But, I can really imagine just this bursting for this is almost, if you want to get into affects and stuff, this rhizomatic form that is
Right.
really unpredictable in some sense. And so, yeah, I can think of like islands of communism again, not in a really naively utopian or prefigurative sense. It's not functional. I'd like to emphasize that it's not functional or pragmatist in
Right.
its orientation, but it's. I mean, Althusser in that interview mentions church as a form of potential islands of communism, sports
Mm.
teams, the very institutions he mentions as ISAs,
Mhm,
ideological
mhm.
state apparatuses. I find that
Yeah.
totally interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things with trap that interests me just in a certain way is the play on language. In a Lacanian sense, the rapper, right, is no longer master of an improvisational rationality of language through enunciation, through clarity. And so you move away from the notorious Big, Eminem, 90s, early 2000s function of the MC or the rapper qua freestylist as the grounds of their superiority over others in competition. And you move to a different form of power and expression of the artist, which is no longer based on the tyranny of language. It's based on other dynamics. And that is interesting because to me, what it means is that trap is a distinctive post 2008 form
Mm,
of an expression of a certain form of social misery that emerges. Um, and um, and so there's that dynamic. And then I think there's the other dynamic, which is certain artists can emerge who, like David Bowie or like Tom Waits or like Kanye West or others, who are artists that have a certain consciousness or awareness of the pliability of forms, and they work kind of at the borderline between them. And those artists obviously interest me. I don't know necessarily that they have a political valence, but maybe you would argue that they do in some ways. I'm not sure. But I mean, I do think if we take a step back, that Attali's general point about the saturation of this moment in musical history and how it's related to political economy he is right that musicians are in a fundamentally different place vis-a-vis their possible role in politicization. And that, I think, just means for us as Marxists that we need to attune ourselves to a different form of reading the political function of music. Like Andre 3000 in his new album, where it was a total affront to a rap album. You may have heard it.
Is that the
I
flute
forget.
one, or am I thinking of something else?
Yeah. Yeah, the flute one. The flute
I
one.
haven't heard it, but yeah, I heard about it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's incredible, right? And it is meditative, and it is like restorative, and uh but it was done as a kind of middle finger to the industry, and maybe you could say to his followers, because he says in the title of the whole thing, like, I'm sorry, this is what you're gonna get. And of course, if one listens to that album, it's glorious. And then, therefore, what is the political effect of that? Well, I would argue that he's shaping a certain political affect of his listeners. And also, in a certain way, after COVID, he's literally making millions of young people that follow him like have the capacity to like deal with anxiety that they're dealing with day to day, because that's what the album really is about in a certain way, is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
calming, you know. So I guess the theme of what we're talking about, Alan, is the surprising and unexpected appearance of politicization in musical forms. And that's actually very beautiful, that fact that it's
Yeah.
rare. I don't know if you agree with that, but it's kind of like a new,
Here's how
yeah.
I'd put it, because like I find myself, as I do get older, like returning to a sort of cantankerous stance. So I do want to suggest and foreground what you're saying, that there is a type of yearning that we actually should not, as say, politically active people, try to predict, because it's already ahead of us. That's the important thing. It's already there, and it's already far beyond us. I don't think we could have predicted trap, going the way it did, from our vantage in the mid 2000s, listening to sort of politically conscious rap. Even with underground hip hop, which I'm much more familiar with in like the 2000s, you had stuff that was like mainly really throwbacky. You had, which is very typical of like postmodernism as a genre. It was like a pastiche form, a brickolated form. And so you had stuff like Aesop Rock, LP, the anti-con people like Clouded. You had little scenes like in LA with like Bus Driver and Subtitle. And at first it sounded all like retro, but there was this like really futuristic edge to it. And I think that was like really crucial there. Like no one could have really predicted what kind of rupture that would have made. And I think if we here's a second point, is like if we overmap our political desires
Right.
onto music, I think that's what becomes like a stultification.
Yeah,
That is like corporate
that is so true.
capture.
And Attali is right about that. And I think it's frustrating, but it is true, which is, let's put it in simple terms. You can have a highly educated Marxist and class conscious musician produce stuff that is like actually quite either unappealing or does the opposite effect, politically speaking.
Mhm.
And I think even we see this fact when we look at David Lynch, who
Yeah.
has like not a political bone in his body, right?
Yeah.
Um, but understands something at a sort of subterranean, unconscious level
Oh, surely. Yeah.
regarding the function of how art is to affect people. Which, okay, from there, as political analysts, we can then sort of identify that in his films and so on. And I think in some sense, the same is true for music. Like, for example, it is likely the case uh, that one will find more latent political content in a Lana Del Rey album than in some explicitly political album, because that's not how like the sign and like the semiology works of
Right,
music.
right, right.
So
Yeah, I mean,
it's like a fundamentally opposed to literalism.
yeah, some of the most explicitly like hortatory, pump your fists, quote unquote leftist political music, like a lot of the riot folk, the melodic hardcore, is some of the most militantly boring and vapid music I can think of. I am sorry, there's some good out here. As a counterexample, here I'll be fair. My friend Sean Kirkpatrick, he was in the band The Paper Chase in the 2000s, and has his own bands, Nervous Curtains and Mirror Box. He's based out of Texas. I'd really recommend everyone check out Nervous Curtains, especially if they want to hear explicitly political music done right. These are lyrics I would never write personally. I counted it. I used the word revolution in my own lyrics once. Not a political, shred in my lyrics. That's not the type of lyric writing I do. Yet I have a common point of identification with him. And it comes down to a rather idiotic question, actually. And it's does it sound good? He writes compelling songs. It is that catharsis. It is that catharsis which is subversive. And it's something, as Jacques Attali points out, that precedes language. It's something that is just like inimitable in how it evades capture. Like his songs are something I don't hear. They're just not something you hear on
Yeah,
the radio. They're not something you hear on curated Spotify playlists. And so that
right.
really amazes me and fascinates me in its attentive sorry attentiveness to form.
Yes, exactly. Because then, therefore, you could define the function of the subversiveness of a musical artist in their capacity to elucidate an affect of that connects with the listener around a particular form of subjection. So if you just go to your playlist, right, and you think of the songs that resonate with you, there's a latent political rationale as to why they resonate with you because they speak to, and this goes back to the augury piece of the musician,
Yeah.
they speak to uh, a form of definition, a form of clarification regarding alienation and subjection, which otherwise you could not ever articulate. So that articulation can never be forced, and it therefore is the magic of the art to bring that out, and it therefore then the content does not need to be explicitly political
For sure. And
because
even if it is, even if it is, I always find that there's magic in a sort of politics of text that you will not predict, if that makes sense. That's why people find Ariel Pink and John Mouse so hateable. So it's almost like punching down, like I find I found Ariel Pink quite pitiful. Not that I necessarily feel sorry for him, but after the January 6th thing, like he just
yeah,
sounded so pathetic in a way. And
yeah,
it's just because, people easily decide that that's not part of their fandom, their political
right,
fandom, as it were, and discard it. I find the cats that are the most interesting are folks like, Nervous Curtains, who I mentioned, who they might have an explicitly leftist, militantly leftist message, but it's stated in a way that is like cold and chilling, like very like unpleasant. Or, my friend Charlie Looker, he has a
hmm
band Extra Life that, to a lot of people, I think those words would be problematic. What has
hmm
been lost? What has been lost?
hmm
Um, and that look back toward canonicity is
yeah,
something that a lot of people don't want to approach, from a lot of angles.
yeah,
That sort of recursion of the past, if we want to talk about the neo feudal, is something
yeah.
that a lot of people will not want in their political texts, but is something I find really actually quite desirable when it comes to the aesthetic question and ultimately the political question.
Yeah, I mean, in a certain way, I mean, I think you see this with Dylan, which is the origin of Dylan's project was founded off of the invention of an alternate persona, right? So he's playing with otherness in the very origin, and he's playing with musical forms um, that are themselves a bricolage of Americana forms.
Yep.
And so he is having to fictionalize himself in order to create something which can connect to a zeitgeist of a moment. And this goes back to the heralding of the future, right? Now, to the extent that that is political, in an early period, we should remember that it was the folk scene had this latent socialist agrarian history for which Dylan was always in an adversarial relationship with,
Right,
right?
right. Yeah.
Remember that? Remember that if you study the history of it? And they had strict rules about how not to break from the forms, like the Newport Music Fest and things like that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And and that interests me in a certain way because even within that Woody Guthrie American socialist form and its strictness, I mean, the truth is you still had great music there, developed, of course. But I wonder if you could speak to that. Like, could you ever envision a form of musical community like that, where it would be kind of bound with these kind of codified rules in a certain way? And like, it is a great irony that after the French Revolution, egalitarian social movements, whether they be communist, socialist, or whatever, or the Jacobins, right, create a sense of music which is more conservative.
Right, right. Well, I mean, not necessarily. You know,
Tell me,
they're
say
actually
more, say more.
yeah, they're actually really interesting flashes. Like one of my favorite examples is Berlioz. Berlioz Symphony Fantastique. Which directly references the French Revolution and March to the Scaffold. I would recommend everyone listen to that. And the ending of that one is grim. Literally, I believe is the snare drum roll. I played this in youth symphony. This is etched into my memory, just like messing it up many times. But like, the snare drum roll at the end is like the basket from the or the head from rolling from the guillotine into the basket, and it is actually quite a stunning tonal display. That Berlioz himself, I believe, was a conservative. I might be wrong about that. Again, I'm not. That's not my period, but like, actually, this is what I'm talking about. There are these sort of unsanctioned displays of tonal daring that I'd suggest that we always listen for,
Mm,
in a perceptive way. I tell everyone that most of my musical training was not in the doing, but in the listening. Those got notorious speed quizzes where we had to just listen twice to a Bach chorale and transcribe the whole thing by ear in 15 minutes, like 3 times a week. It's in the listening, and you don't have to do that obviously if you're not a classical composer or whatever. But you know, uh, it's about listening sensitively for the unexpected. And again, the type of subversion you might hear will not necessarily be mapped one to one to
right,
political subversion. And I think what you're talking about in terms of a codified um, locus of, say, folk singers, I think Bob
right.
Dylan is absolutely interesting in that it's envisioned as a sort of subversive scene, but is it really? You know, is it when there are so many sanctioned rules on how to be properly socialist, properly populistic? Um, and we've seen that so many times with the New Left, how they sort of uh, shade actually then into their authoritarian parody when they start to harden into identitarian categories. And I think we're starting to see a very big problem with that in terms of what is sanctioned in certain, I would call them fandoms, consumer fandoms of signification.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I grew up where in a family which put Neil Young's music on a pedestal of purity. So much so, Alan, that my uncle only listens to Neil Young, but doesn't often listen to Neil Young's metal, like what's called Crazy Horse, his band Crazy Horse, because
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Neil has his acoustic music.
yeah,
And his acoustic music, my uncle will listen to at all times and feel comfortable and at ease and in kind of homeostasis and so on. So it's for him, it's about kind of like comfort, because like the otherness of these other musical forms, makes him feel a certain way that he wants to
right,
avoid.
right,
That's what I understand this to be. It's a kind of purity, which is not necessary, which is kind of benign. Like it's not a
yeah,
problem in
yeah,
some sense. It's innocent. Like every year in San Francisco, my uncle would travel to hear Neil Young's performance at the Bridge School,
yeah,
because Neil Young has several children born with Down syndrome, and he does a fundraiser, and it's all acoustic only. And he brings all of these famous musicians, and they can play acoustic.
hmm,
So my uncle could tolerate that because it was all acoustic, even though he's introduced all these new musicians, which was a little traumatic for him. Um, so I kind of see it more like that, like agrarian, um, sort of approach to art as non-complexity, or as like, let's avoid too much experimentation. And so that to me is a bit benign, and it's humbling and maybe even a little cute. Like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
not,
yeah.
you know what I mean? Like it's not necessarily pernicious.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But still, nonetheless, it is a community um governed by a certain set of frameworks and kind of boundaries. And so I just wonder, like, I wonder if you find, I wanted to ask you about music and community building, if I could. I know that's maybe a hard question to riff on. Maybe I'll put it in this form of a question, Alan. Can we still build musical communities that have political efficacy or valence, or you know what I mean? Like how might that look?
I
Or
think
is the market just simply kind of so hegemonic that it's kind of naive to think that we could do that?
I think that question is seriously complicated with this question of the virtual, right? So a big part of Jody Dean's neo-feudalism thesis is number one, the parth parcelization of sovereignty, which leads to an overall parcelization of geography, much like you might see in sort of pre-modern feudalisms. And I think this is a huge barrier to building community in terms of music and politics for that matter. Um, and there's still the internet, but very notably, it is not there in terms of playing music with other musicians in real time over the internet. I mean, we're just barely getting there, and um uh it's not really a viable technology yet. And so kind of the limit of it is right now what say me and what Jacob and I are doing, where it's a sort of asynchronous back and forth type of improvisation. And I think that the notion of community also is just disrupted in its very form with this uh, circuit of noise that is the preeminent form of communication within postmodern capital. That there is no community as such, in that we all, to an extent, interface through, I mean, you might call it spectacle, you might call it screen, might call it simulacrum, but I think that is severely complicated. And so we might want to then turn to approaching what is definitionally an island of communism. I actually do find it very cute. You might actually go back to like the SPD and the fact that they had their own choirs and stuff like that. That is very cute. I find that
Yeah,
actually very
I think it's
endearing.
fine. Yeah. I mean,
I yeah.
that's actually very an interesting point, which is, I mean, we all know the struggles in the neo-feudal era, if we want to call it that, of what it takes to have a successful band. And the truth is, right, that it requires so much entrepreneurial hustle and grit and blood, sweat, and tears that for most bands, it's like on almost like a kind of Darwinian battlefield, right? And it doesn't come easy, right? Sleeping on the road, sleeping in vans, and poverty and sacrifices. People can't have families, stuff like that,
Right,
right?
right.
For what ends, right? Well, politically speaking, you might say, well, it would be nice to link all of that to the cause of a party. I could envision a scenario in which a beloved band that is widely appealing is connected, and I would even say instrumentally connected to a socialist party apparatus. Like, in other words, I could envision that happening in a non-instrumentalized way, in a non-cheap,
Yeah.
a non-commodified way. Why not? Why not? So
I
give
am
me
all
one reason why not.
I no, I am all for that. Back in my days of more active organizing and these sort of more class struggle Marxist organizational formats, I hate to say it, but during the Bush years, with this sort of hysterical, I mean that in a psychoanalytic sense, hysterical vantage of the anti-Bush, anti-war movement, I'd say the taste level in music was really bad. It was that type of explicit, over literal, ham-fisted political messaging I was talking about. And kinda, if it didn't have that over literalness, it was not worth listening to for most activists. I really could not have a musical discussion with other activists. It was actually very odd that I was a musician in
Right.
a socialist organization, but was not able to have musical discussions. And so, the musical acts we would have brought to, say, conferences were all in
Right.
that vein. What I'd
Right.
suggest is that, if there were such a Leninist formation that could, have that sort of space, that sort of power to create a space, maybe even state power, that would be the type of project, that it would be non-instrumental, that it'd be non-functionalist, that it would be more of a facilitator for an island of communism. I always remember what Terry Eagleton says about his picture of communism. He's just as non-committal as anyone else in terms of what free association means. I think anyone who wants to fill out that picture of what free association is a fool. I think that is propaganda, if you know
Mhm.
what free association means. But I mean, there is that, Marx quote about, I don't remember, tilling the fields, fishing during the day,
Yeah.
doing
Yeah, of course.
criticism at night, and whatever it is. I think that is sort of a blueprint. You know, that sort of
Yeah.
excess of doing criticism at night,
Yeah.
reading books and doing criticism, that remainder of uselessness. I love Terry Eagleton for pointing out the supreme
Yeah.
uselessness of doing literary criticism.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's well, comrade, this has been very stimulating and turned out extremely well. Great
Yeah,
conversation here, Alan.
thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, this is I mean, I just want to encourage folks to check out Lunafaction, to check out Scribe Wolf on both on Bandcamp, to check out the various work that Alan has done for our channel and to thank him for that. And also to read Jacques Attali's very interesting book called Noise, Political, what is it called? A Political Economy of Music?
Yes, I believe so. Yep.
Yeah, it's really, really great book.
Yeah,
Very, very thought-provoking. Very thought-provoking. And perhaps we may uh, do other episodes because there also are some critiques of this book.
certainly.
Um,
Yep.
Similar to critiques of French theory that we have talked about on the show. So I want to take your invitation for us to start doing more stuff on art and aesthetics,
Absolutely.
and so yeah, that's something we should definitely continue doing, and hopefully we can have you back on
That
at
sounds
some
great.
point soon.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and keep up the good work.
Thanks, Alan. All the best.
All right, later.
See you guys.
Of the object moment,